Hey folks, welcome to Roll of Law. Today I wanted to talk about a board game that I picked up and I really liked, so I'm going to do a bit of a board game review. But one of the things I liked about this is that I think I can use it in my tabletop role-playing games. So I'm going to be talking about how I could steal this to use in my tabletop role-playing games and how you can too legally, what the boundaries are, what the protections are for board games. So the game I'm talking about is Jaipur. And this is not a super niche game. It's a popular one. It's gone through multiple printings, but it's a pretty solid game. It's a two-player game, so only two people. That's kind of rare in the board gaming field, and it's got some advantages and disadvantages, but my wife and I like to play board games sometimes, so having a two-player game is a pretty cool thing. Now, you'll note that the theming of this is very much sort of Middle Eastern. It's a Middle Eastern trading game. But the theme doesn't play a heavy role in this, and that's going to be very important if we want to borrow this and use it in some other setting, because if you wanted to use this in a tabletop role-playing game, for example, it's a lot easier if it fits the setting. If you're playing a game that's set in the Arabian Nights, this is already ready to go. But if you're set in sort of medieval Europe, which is maybe the most common kind of setting, not as much. So this one plays fairly quickly. They say on the box half an hour. I think my wife and I got through most of our games quicker than that. So long as you're not really lingering over decisions, it's going to be fairly fast. So here's what the board game setup looks like. And there's a few things I want to sort of draw your attention to in this setup. One, and this is something that when I was initially looking at the rules, I thought maybe they had this wrong, or maybe this was not the best design choice. And then in playing the game, I realized, no, this is absolutely how it should and needs to work. So you'll notice these little chips here that are all set up, and they're set up sort of splayed out. You can do that for your first few games. Once you kind of know the point system, you may just set them up as stacks. But the different kinds of resources that you're going for don't all have the same point value. And that can be fairly dramatic. So the rubies, for example, start out at 7 points. So they've got the 7-point chip at the top, and then later become worth less, not worthless, but worth less at 5 points. Whereas some of the other resources might have a much more precipitous drop. So we've got what I think are shoes, I'm guessing, the brown tiles here, which the top one is worth 4 points. The next one after that is 3, then 2, and then you have this big stack of 1s. So all of these things, you can see that the first person to buy that is doing a lot better than the last person to buy it. Now, how do you get these resources? Because these resources are significant. In fact, they are the main source of where you get points to win the game. Well, you get them by collecting cards. And you see the set that's out in the middle. Each person's going to start off with a hand of cards, and your hand can be up to 5 to start. But when you get your starting card, any of these cards that are these camels, you put them in front of you. They are your sort of herd of camels. And at that point, you're going to be trying to collect sets. And a set can really be of any size except for the 3 sort of most expensive resources, which you need at least 2 cards to make a set. But the way you would use these is just on your turn, there are one of several things you can do. And one of those things is that you can discard one of those cards in order to take a number of those resource victory cards that is equal to the amount that you play. Now, if you have a bigger set of cards, so, 2, but if you get up to 3, 4, or 5, you get additional bonus points for a large set. The camels work a little differently. Each camel, you just sort of collect those, and at the end of the game, the person, or at the end of each round, the person with the most camels gets a 5 victory point bump, which can be significant because if you can take that away from the other player mid-game, that's essentially a 10-point swing. It's a big deal. Now, On your turn, you can do, as I mentioned, one of several things. And it's critical the one of, because this creates a fair bit of tension. You have to build for what you're planning on doing, and then you have to do it later. So on your turn, you can either take cards or sell cards. And selling cards is the thing of playing them in order to get the victory points off the thing. Now, taking cards has different sub-styles. One is you can take from that pool of 5 cards that you see in the middle, you can take either a single resource card, and then you just get that card and you get to keep it. This increases your hand size, but you have a limit of 7 cards. You cannot take a card if it would result in you having 8 cards left in your hand. That's not allowed. So that 7 card limit ends up being a tactical choice, because if you're getting up to 7 cards and something really good lands there, you can't take it. So you have to really think about hand size management in that sense. Or you can take several goods if you want to take more than one thing, but this option doesn't increase your hand size, because each of the things you take you have to replace with a card from your hand, a different card. So you can do that swapping, but note that this is useless to you unless you've got the cards in your hand. So this is the other aspect of hand size management. You don't want it to get too big that it limits you, but you also don't want it to get too small that it limits you. The third option is to take the camels. Now the camels, as noted, don't play the same way as the other cards, and so the camels have a bit of a strategic element to it. You'd like to get the camel points. That's a good thing to have, but the camels don't necessarily decide the game. And when you take the camels, you have to take every camel. So you see in this sort of sample setup, there's 3 camels face up. If you take those camels, then that reveals 3 things to your opponent, who can then, they've kind of got a smorgasbord. So this also creates some tension there. Selling the cards, as mentioned, you play those cards as a set, and then you get to take as many of those chips as you want. Note that it is better to have bigger sets, in the sense that you'll get more of those chips, and you can also get some of those really big value. The 5-point set bonuses can be huge, in the sense of being worth like 10 extra points. But the wrinkle on all of that is that if you wait too long, you can end up getting sniped. So let's say I mentioned before the brown tokens, the sort of shoes, I think they are. The top 3 are worth a lot more points per chip than the others. And so, for example, when my wife and I were playing, she was collecting, and I could see what she's collecting because I can see which cards she's taking. She was collecting to get a set of 5 of these. Like, she's collecting a big set. So I had 3 of them in my hand, and I played those 3 and took the 2, 3, 4 chips off the top, leaving only the 1 chips after that. That, of course, means that I don't get the 5-point set bonus that was being sort of sought after there. But I also got to skim off the cream on that. And so there can be a lot of tension between, do I build now, and do I take the sort of higher values that are there? This can be important, especially because all of your moves are public. The other person can see what you're playing. So I really like this game. There's not a lot of 2-player games, and this one played quite well. It's got some chance elements to it, in the sense that there is a draw deck, and when certain resources are drawn becomes a big factor. But there's a lot of tension to it, and a fair bit of thought as well. It's not a pure chance game, but it's also not a pure skill game. It's a good mixture of both, or at least a good mixture for my table. So I really liked this game, and I thought, this is a great game for quick play, which is kind of important, but it's also one that you can kind of use in a tabletop game as some sort of gambling game. It would be easy to play Jaipur for money or something like that, And I'm not suggesting that you do that. I'm just saying if you're playing this in a tabletop game, you probably, like if it's a game within a game where you've got characters who are playing this, you probably have some sort of stakes. Maybe there's money on the line. Maybe people are playing this because there's a bet for, some piece of property, some piece of information, something that is desired. And so the fact that you could theoretically have this as money wagered on this is a good thing for that purpose. When you play this in actual practice, you're playing it's a best 2 out of 3. So at most you're playing 3 rounds. Now that means it's going to be fairly quick, which is a good thing as well, because if it's a 2-player game, this is the biggest weakness. You're going to have 2 people playing and other people sitting around. Now, there's all sorts of ways you could have other people trying to cheat this using magic or other things, which might involve other people. But so long as it's quick, so long as you can get this done relatively fast, it might be a moment where other people are willing to not take the lead in order to sort of have that tension. But you've got to play it carefully. I would not recommend, for instance, running a tournament of this where there's going to be a lot of time of people sitting around not doing anything. It would be good for just one sort of round. Now, I mentioned I think I'm going to use this in tabletop games. This could be sort of an equivalent of poker for a different world. But the problem that you run into is that the theme on this is kind of specific. You've got everything is very desert themed. So you've got your camels, you've got your this, you've got your that. So how can I take this and make it different if I want to use it in, say, a game that's set in kind of equivalent of medieval fantasy Europe? Or maybe maybe I want to use this as like a hacking thing for a cyberpunk game. How would I do that? Well, it's not all that difficult. One of the things that you do here is you just take every resource and you would I think that the thing I was saying is shoes might be maybe it's pottery, I don't know. Leather goods, I think. So you might take these brown leather goods cards and replace them with for instance, foot soldiers. And then you could replace the much more expensive cards like the silver. These things are worth 5 points. You might replace that with, say, siege equipment. This could be a battering ram. I could replace the rubies with ballista. I could replace the gold with trebuchets. And, then I can swap other things out. Instead of tea, we've got archers. And so at that point, I can really create a version for version equivalent that is now themed in medieval combat. And medieval combat is something that you find in all sorts of games. Go is arguably a tactical game, but chess much more so. You see that, you've got your knights and your pawns and so forth, all of which are kind of themed around a military conflict. So that works really well. Now, you might be saying, what about, copyright and trademark and all of these things? Well, I couldn't find any patents for covering this specific game, and I would be very surprised if any existed, because a lot of board game mechanics are going to be hard to patent, but that doesn't mean that they can't be. In terms of the copyright, you can't actually copyright the basic mechanics and the basic math of this. So the fact that there are, for example, 5 of these silver tokens, each being worth 5 points, cannot be copyrighted. You can freely borrow this. In fact, you could make a version of Jaipur and sell it, and there would be no remedy so long as you avoid certain pitfalls. One of those pitfalls I didn't look up. Jaipur may be trademarked. And if it's trademarked, then you can't use that name. You shouldn't use that name anyway. I wouldn't, I would say stay away from that in any event. You also can't use any of the original art. So if you wanted to make your own version of this, you'd have to invent new art and for all of these things. Like this is the 3-point bonus art. It's good art. I mean, it illustrates what it's for and so forth. You couldn't use it. All of that you'd have to redo. And that can be fairly simple or fairly elaborate, but that's up to you. The other thing, and this is the major source of protection for most board games, is this thing here, the manual. The manual is kind of the primary way that board games tend to be protected from copies, because you can't copy this as part of your thing. Now, you're probably saying, wait a minute, didn't you just say that the mechanics can't be copyrighted? Correct. But the descriptions of the mechanics, the descriptions of how these work, can, to the extent that it is possible to come up with different versions. Now, this gets complicated in practice, and if you're looking at selling anything or anything like that, you want to be really careful. Sales, by the way, isn't inherently a requirement for copyright infringement, but if I'm using this in a game, the way I'm getting around the manual problem is I'm just not using the manual. I will just explain how the game works in character. And that also gives me all sorts of options, because if my NPC is explaining the game, how the game works, I can maybe, if I'm making this a shady NPC, have them explain it badly. You ever played board games with somebody who like always leaves out a couple of rules, and then you find out those rules around scoring, and it's always, that they just left out a couple of rules that happen to help them? Well, if you've got a shady NPC, that's one thing you could do to further create tension with your players. You'd have to decide how they'd react to that, but it is an option. But, you can do funny voices, you can all of that. So within a tabletop role-playing game, not a problem. I just don't make any other copy of the manual. If I were trying to sell a reskinned Jaipur, and I don't really feel the need to, but there's lots of games on the market that are essentially reskinned versions of previous games or redone. Sometimes people want to make a single improvement to a board game, and so they just make a new board game using all the mechanics of a previous game plus something new. You'd have to be very careful about how you do this. You want to not copy the manual and create your own manual from scratch, basically. Now, some things may end up being similar simply because in some cases there's only so many ways to express a thing. Like, you can only take one action each turn. That's a really important element to this game, but there's only so many ways to express it. There's not a lot of different ways to phrase that. That aspect has less copyright protection than something, well, for instance, on the back of this, there is the descriptions of the designers and there's sort of little blurbs about the game. That would have a lot more protection. But, the layout, all of these things you'd want to be very careful not to copy. But so long as you avoid any of the copyrighted elements or trademarked elements, so the art, the text, the names, any of these things, the mechanics are free for you to use. So, as I said, I'm going to end up borrowing this to use in tabletop games. I'm also going to keep playing this. My wife and I have not gotten tired of it. We've played many rounds. We're probably going to play many more. It's a great game. You'll note, if you want to make a copy of it, the other thing, if you want to borrow this to use in a tabletop game, I encourage you to buy a copy. You'll note that I didn't give you exact card counts or anything like that in this video, so you can't just watch this video and make a copy, because I encourage you to buy a copy. As much as you can do this kind of cloning, the people behind this game did good work. I actually think this is a really good game. of the two-player games that my wife and I play, it might be our favorite. We liked it a lot more than we liked Seven Wonders Duel. Um, we liked it a bit more than the Mr. Jack games. It's just a really solid game for that purpose. So I think it's a great game. I'd give it, 4 out of 5, which for the two-player market is powerful. So, but I recommend this one. I really like this one, and the only downside is the fact that it's a two-player game. I don't really know of a good way to scale it up. I don't think it could be scaled up without losing certain critical elements of it. But yeah, give it a try. As I said, I recommend this one, and I'm just going to note, I have not been paid to do any review of this. I picked this up at full price at my local board game store. I may do more board game reviews. If I ever am doing a compensated review, like if I've ever received a game or something like that, I will let you know. And I don't plan to do... And the other thing is, I will let you know at any point what the terms of that review are. And I will not accept any review offers that say, we'll pay you X much money to give a positive review. That's not how I'm going to roll on this channel ever. And I guess if that changes, because people change, I'll let you know that too. But I don't really have a whole lot of regard for a review that is just... I mean, at the end of the day, those are just reviews of how many dollars the creator got. So, yeah. Anyway, I really like this one. I'm doing the review mostly because I like this game a lot and wanted to share it with you. So, thank you guys for watching. I know it's been a while since I did one, but see you next time.